Welcome to the Bioethics Babe podcast, where we examine the tough questions in human flourishing in light of science, faith, and culture. I'm your host, Darina Grosso-Agnew. Now let's dive in. Has caring for creation become so politicized that many Catholics have forgotten what the Church actually teaches? My guest today is Clare Ath, co-founder and president of Vita, Terra, a Catholic environmental organization working to reclaim an authentically Catholic vision of environmental stewardship. Clare is a Catholic, wife, mother of 4 boys, pro-life advocate, and former West Virginia County Commissioner. Together, we will unpack the Church's rich tradition of creation care from Genesis to Laudato Si, discuss environmental toxins through the lens of Catholic bioethics, and examine why caring for creation is ultimately about protecting human dignity and promoting authentic human flourishing. Clare, welcome to Bioethics Babe.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
It's a pleasure, and this is such an important topic, and I'm so glad to have recently learned of this new organization. So for listeners who may not know you, tell us about yourself and what led you to co-found Vita Terra.
Yes, so I am someone who's been very involved in the pro-life movement for, probably over a decade at this point. I got started as a sidewalk counselor, actually in South Bend, Indiana, when I was in undergrad. And I started there, and I just got more and more involved in the movement. And I've spent the past 3 years working for a really great pregnancy resource network. And what I've come to realize is that everything that Pope Francis said is right about the throwaway culture. And just that I started to see abortion is a symptom of this much bigger disease. And that if we want to stop abortion, we can't just focus only on abortion. It's connected to all these other issues and what he talked about as a throwaway culture, but that we're viewing children as disposable. Our responsibilities is something that aren't really responsibilities. We can disregard them if we don't like them. And the natural world around us. So I think in my pursuit of wanting to end abortion and, end this stain on not just American history, but on the global world, I just became really passionate about getting involved in a movement to have an overall care for creation so that while we obviously care about the human person and human dignity, we also need to have care for the natural world. And it's something I started to realize that in a lot of Catholic circles and, center-right political circles, we just kind of disregard nature and the environment as this like progressive thing. We're not going to get involved in this. But I genuinely do believe they are connected. And if we want to end abortion, we also need to be focused on care for the natural world.
And we are definitely going to unpack all of that because I do think that there is such an important link between those. But let's talk about Vita et Terra. So you started it, you co-founded it a few months ago, right?
Yes.
And how did you decide on the name Vita et Terra, literally life and earth? And what does it say about your mission?
Yes. So I thought the name Vita et Terra would be really cool because we're Catholic, so having a Latin name is always fun. But just that our mission is to reunite these two things that have become kind of separated, life and earth. And they're two things that should have not been taken apart. So just that it really speaks to the heart of our mission that we want life and earth to come back together. And also kind of a play on that. It's one of the problems that I've kind of personally seen in the current environmental movement is that people will place the earth above human life. And, what is that proper order? Kind of raising that question.
Mm-hmm. And what misconceptions do Catholics most commonly have about environmental stewardship, would you say?
Yeah, I think one of the most common issues is that they just write it off, to be honest, is just to think, environmental stewardship, the environment in quotes, like, we don't want to get involved in this. But then the problem is by not getting involved in it, we've ceded the conversations to a lot of times secular individuals and people who place the planet above human beings. So by us not getting involved, we've ceded the conversation to some really bad ideas. And that's why it's all the more important for Catholics to get involved.
I think that's such an important point Because again, if we are not present in a specific area, then a certain principle or values of culture, of the predominant culture, are going to take over. And so if we don't infuse that with Catholic teaching,
Exactly.
what's there, we have to be the salt and light in every area, and including in discussions about the environment. So, for example, the climate debate, right? Whether, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on, is there climate change? Is there global warming? But all of these questions, for example, have become so politicized that many Catholics aren't sure what to believe. How should they approach it? How should they even think about this issue in particular?
Yeah, I think how Catholics should approach it is first looking at scripture, looking at early church fathers, looking at church teachings, and realizing that not everything needs to be a policy. Like, you don't need a policy and a politic type answer for everything. We just needed to be guided by the underlying principles of human dignity and of creating a world around us that's thriving for the human person and the human family. But I know a lot of times, obviously, global warming and climate change, all these things get brought up. And kind of how I think about it is that we're called as Christians to do something regardless. So whatever the science is on if the world is heating, what the role of man is on the global warming, it just goes back to we should care regardless. And we have a duty. And I know, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about Genesis and being given dominion, not domination over the earth. And so this is something that we're called to do. If we want to live a virtuous life, we really need to be thinking about how we're living our everyday life.
Hmm. And why do you think that many faithful Catholics have become so skeptical of environmentalism?
I think they've become skeptical, rightfully so, in a lot of cases. I even just think about growing up in the 90s and early thousands, you had people like Al Gore, and they're pushing these narratives that are in a lot of cases just flat out wrong, and really just tried to prey upon people's fears and just have a movement that was very alarmist. And I think as Catholics, we're called to be hopeful. And so that in of itself, doesn't really fit with being a Catholic, is we can't be living in this constant state of panic and doom and the end is near. So I think that made people kind of step away. But then, as we said, it's not good to then seed the conversation, because I think we saw a lot of these predictions not happen about, polar ice caps melting at the rate that they were supposed to. And even a few years ago, AOC was saying, in 10 years, XYZ is going to happen. And now here we are at the 10-year mark, and it hasn't happened. That's just made people be like, maybe it's just not real, and we shouldn't really care. God's got it handled. But I think that we should care.
Hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Catholic vision for creation. Why should Catholics care about the environment as a matter of faith rather than politics?
Mhm. I think, to be honest, it's always a good thing to not frame things through politics. Because politics is something that is always changing. There's a lot of money involved. It may not always be seeking the truth, but that we should be viewing things through our faith. And if we look at things through our faith, scripture begins in a garden, and it begins with Genesis. And it kind of teaches us, three things: that God created human beings are good, and that we're called to live in communion with one another and point to the Creator. So I think as Catholics, it's just really important to focus on our faith and not so much the changing winds of politics.
Hmm. And you did mention that Scripture gives humanity dominion over creation. Can you talk about the difference between dominion and domination?
Mhm. So dominion is very different from domination, because it's really governing and what we've been entrusted with. It's a different mindset of going into things, that you're not seeking control, to be honest. So if you think about, in the old days, you had kings, like, you didn't want someone who was going to have domination and rule with a heavy fist over his subjects. You wanted someone who was going to seek the best and seek the good for his people. And that's the same way that God has entrusted us with the environment.
And obviously included in the environment is all of creation, animals, obviously, as you mentioned, the planet, etc. So it's over all creation, right? And what we know from scripture and the faith is that humanity is the crown of creation, and being given this dominion means that we need to take care of all of creation, using our reason, using the gifts that God has given us. And so let's tie this to how this works with loving God and loving neighbor. So what is the tie between caring for creation and loving God and loving our neighbor?
I think that the tie is very, very practical, to be honest. So it looks like things that if you are an individual or a corporation and you're poisoning the river, that's going to affect your neighbor. That's going to affect people. If you're destroying farmland with chemicals and degrading the soil and not doing what you can to practice, restorative farming methods, these are all things that are connected to your neighbor and to the person and will have these kind of trickle down effects. One of the biggest examples I could think of. So I live very close, probably like 2 miles from the Potomac River. And I don't know if you heard earlier this year, it was when we were getting the crazy snows in the winter, that apparently they were not properly managing the infrastructure. There were pipes that were very, very old. They decayed, they burst. And so all of this sewage rushed into the Potomac. And it was, I can't really remember now, but it was something crazy, like 200 or 300 billion gallons of sewage went into the Potomac. And this is already a river it's not the best, not the cleanest water, but it had drastic effects on wildlife. Like I'm reading on the community pages of dead fish just like floating next to people's houses. They say to keep your pets away. Obviously you don't want small children going near it. And it's just something like having clean water is so important for the local wildlife as well as people who are probably going to be drinking that water at some point. And also then when it's summer, you want to go fishing, you want to go boating, and you don't want to be doing that in a sewage river. And so I think that's just one really good example of how things like infrastructure is important and it's related to the environment. And then the environment in turn is related to people.
Right. And actually, about the Potomac, a few years ago, I went through sailing certification, and a part of that, I had to go into the Potomac, and I was a little leery about going into the Potomac for the reasons you state. You don't want to be in dirty water, right? So obviously, even just for enjoyment of the environment, for our health and safety, we should really care about what happens to our environment. How is the Catholic understanding of creation different from both exploitation on one hand and nature worship on the other hand?
I think the Catholic understanding is different because it really rejects both extremes that we're being given. Because the reality is we do see nature worship. And people might say, like, it's a fringe group. But when you look at the overall environmental movement, there's a lot of people that are placing the planet first. And they're viewing humans as the thing to be kind of mitigated. And that's something that it's not just I personally have a problem with. Like it's wrong. And when you're examining solutions, they're looking at different carbon emission levels or, ensuring the water is clean, like we were just talking about. You can never view limiting the population as the solution to those problems. And I think that's when, as Catholics, God put us here for a reason. So we have to come up with better solutions. We have to be called to innovate. And it's just a very unfortunate scenario when you start seeing people say that humans are the problem. And I think I shared it on Twitter the other day. I had seen the Daily Mail ran an article and said, all these scientists, blah, 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 came together and said that we need to cut the Earth's population in half over the next 100 years or something. And I think when scientists and, the academics start making these kinds of assertions and policy solutions, they're not looking at the full picture, and they're putting the planet as the only variable that they care about. Because I'm sure you know and have talked to other guests about, but the birth rate is an issue. And if we cut half of the world's population, what is that going to do to kind of our social structures, the economies of different nations? And I just don't really think they're accounting for all those variables. The only thing they're accounting for is carbon output.
And yeah, you're completely right. And we're actually not replacing ourselves currently. So the birth rate is down. And again, the issue is if you're putting nature above human beings, human lives, you have it inverted, right? But as you said, it's important for us to come up with better solutions, not to eliminate people, but to come up with better solutions that help nature and help people ultimately. And so that's the solution. It's not, one of the things we say in bioethics is eliminate the suffering, not the sufferer. In a similar way, eliminate pollution, eliminate the things that harm the environment. Don't eliminate the human beings, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that there's a link there. So let's talk about church teaching specifically. Many people think that Pope Francis invented Catholic environmental teaching. What's the longer history?
Yeah, I remember when Laudato Si came out, there was a big buzz in the media and in all honesty in kind of the secular world, because they're like, oh, look, Catholics are talking about the environment. But the way I kind of think about it is this obviously, as I'm sure you know, was not the first time Catholics have talked about the environment, but it was the first time that it was compiled and kind of summarized. And so I think while Pope Francis, said a lot of great things, he was really just building upon past teachings and things that Benedict had built upon and Pope John Paul. And he really dialed in on kind of what I was talking earlier with the issues about the birth rate and that we can't just cut it because there's all these variables, that the world is interconnected and we can't just view things that, oh, this is the environment, this is the economy, this is the human person. They all work together. And that is, I think, what Laudato Si was trying to do, was just shine a light on the fact that, hey, as Catholics, we are called to care for all of creation. And this is how these puzzle pieces kind of fit together. And there was obviously a big component talking about if we don't take action, the first people who are affected by environmental degradation is often the poor, and we are also called to care for the poor. So just looking at this big picture of why we need to take action, and if we don't, kind of what the trickle-down effects of that may be.
Mm-hmm. And how did Saint Francis of Assisi influence the church's understanding of creation?
I think that he has actually had a lot of great quotes, and I know I've used some on Twitter, where he really viewed creation. He discussed it as something that is a reminder of our creator, and use the natural world as like a lens that if we look at the forest, this should be a reminder to you of who created it. So I think St. Francis was someone that used creation to point us back to our creator and our purpose for being. So that while scripture and the Bible and church tradition and history, all of that is very important, but there is another component of just enjoying the beautiful world that God has given us.
And what would you say that the contributions of St. John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI make to environmental teaching before Laudato Si? Because again, I think that there's this misconception that, well, Pope Francis, this is an area that he championed and no one else has. Yeah. But what have both St. John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI have said, either in writings or in their homilies, about the environment?
Yeah. I am a very big Pope John Paul fan. I think his theology of the body is great, but he did speak to the environment as well. And I know that one of the main points that Pope John Paul emphasized was just that everything kind of points back to this moral disorder within the human heart. And that is the root that we need to address. So kind of as I said, the my passion and motivation for starting Vita at Terra was looking at the fact that we are disordered, we are sinful, we are fallen, and we really need to strive to follow God's call for our lives and have a properly ordered life. So I think that Pope John Paul and Benedict both emphasized kind of the moral component of the human heart and how that relates to the degradation of nature.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions about Laudato Si?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions, and it's because, like I mentioned, more progressives kind of got very excited about this. People took it to be like a policy prescription, or that, we have to look at Laudato Si and take action today and implement policies XYZ. But the reality is, like, Catholics can disagree on what the policy solutions are. We're called to have the same foundation and like moral beliefs, but it's going to look different. Like there's no exact, we have to have a carbon tax. We have to have, this economic policy decision. Those are things that Catholics can debate, and it's good to debate. But Laudato Si wasn't saying you have to do X, Y, Z. And I think a lot of people thought that's what it was.
Mm-hmm. And so what are some of the central themes that every Catholic should understand about Laudato Si?
I think the biggest theme of Laudato Si is the overall idea that creation is a gift. That creation's a gift and, everything belongs to God. So if we put that as kind of the first thing we're thinking about, or that is our thing that we're pointing to, everything else will start to fall into place. If we're making creation as a gift as kind of our central point in life. But as I mentioned, he really started with that, but then broke it down into that creation is a gift. And if we don't steward it properly, the poor are who is going to be most affected. And, we do see this across the world and in the global South. You always hear about fast fashion, and you know that it's bad. So famous. I was on an airplane, and it was a documentary about Brandy Melville, which was a really big fashion brand, I guess, in mid-thousands. But just that people would buy all these clothes, and they just buy a shirt. It would last like 3 months, buy another. And it all gets sent over to Africa. And there's just these it's the ocean, but it's just filled with shirts and clothes and trash and just everything we bought in America that we throw away got shipped over to the third world. And they're testing the water and showing like the microplastic levels are just crazy. And the people are drinking this water to show that, again, we're all interconnected and that the things that we do have effects on other people. And it's most often the poor who are going to be the first impacted.
I think that's a really key example because, how aware are we of what happens to garbage, right? And the process it goes through, how it ends up affecting the environment, which affects our health. And we're definitely going to do an episode on endocrine disruptors and other issues within the environment that affect our health, because this isn't just a theoretical thing. As you're saying, this affects each one of us, but even more so the most vulnerable and the poor in the world. Pope Francis speaks about integral ecology. What does that term actually mean?
Yeah, so integral ecology, it just goes back to this point that everything is connected. So, just with that past example of fast fashion, that we're over here in America, we think that our consumption and our choices, it's just going to affect my life and I'm throwing it in the garbage can outside my front door. So how is that going to affect somebody else? But it does, that everything is connected.
Mm-hmm. And one of the encyclical's central ideas, as you mentioned, is that everything is connected. What other examples of this do you have in terms of how our consumption, our relationship with the environment affects other people?
Well, so one thing I did want to highlight with kind of this integral ecology is the idea that everything is connected, but not everything is equal. I do think that's a misconception some people have, is that everything is on equal footing. But it's always important to remember that like we need to prioritize human beings and the well-beings of humans above everything else. But trying to think of other examples of how things are connected. I don't know. Do you have any that come off the top of your head?
You know, especially as I mentioned with endocrine disruptors, I think about potentially some of the chemicals in the water, right?
Mhm.
From the abortion pill, from the contraceptive pill as well. And there were some articles just even in terms of, you know, air quality and I guess production that's done in other parts of the world where there aren't as strict guidelines for what happens. Well, that air still travels, right? I mean, everything's connected. It really takes every single country to care about these issues because everything gets recycled in some way, right?
Yeah.
And so it affects all of us as on, on Earth and beyond. So I would say that, yeah, I'm really interested myself in the issue of water quality and how whatever chemicals end up in our water, whatever hormones end up in our water, how those are affecting us physically and,
Yeah.
and even our fertility, et cetera. When you're sticking progesterone and estrogens in the water, we know how fish can even change, in the way that they develop because of some of these issues. I don't know if you've studied some of that too.
Yeah.
Um,
No, that's definitely a great point.
so you mentioned that obviously just because, we should care about the environment doesn't mean that we have to agree on every single policy, because there's room for disagreement or what are the actual policy things that we should implement. What would you say are the key ideas that all Catholics should keep in mind, regardless of those policy
Mhm.
decisions?
Yeah. I think that the main thing Catholics need to keep in mind is prioritizing human beings and also looking at every situation individually. And I'm sure we'll talk about like subsidiarity and the importance of having local actors and local people make decisions because blanket policy or bans, restrictions, regulations is never that great of an idea. And it actually makes me think of a story I had read about, and I verified it. It was true that this past summer, there's been crazy heat waves everywhere. I know we had one in Washington, D.C., but Europe was very, very affected. And in Europe, this number just blew me away. So in the United States, we had around 2 to 3,000 people die from heat related exposure last year. In Europe, it was 60,000 people died from the heat. And
Wow.
a lot of that comes down to air conditioning, that it's not as common. Sometimes it's an affordability issue, but a lot of times there's ordinances and regulations against air conditioning. And I had actually read about a man, I believe he lived in France. I think it was Paris. He was an elderly man, disabled, and he tried to install an AC unit, like a personal one, in his window in his apartment. And the police came in and removed it
Mm.
because it it's against their policies because air conditioning can cause emissions and that can cause overall global warming. But again, you need to look at things at an individual basis. If there's an elderly man who's disabled, like, I'm sorry, he should be able to have an AC unit. We can come up with something else to help drive down overall carbon emissions. And then one of the things this again was shocking to me that we'll do all of these different policies to tackle our emissions problem. But then wildfires dump so much carbon emissions into our atmosphere. And so in my mind, it's like we need to be figuring out how we can better manage our forests, and have that side of stewardship under control, and that will take care of the little bit of emissions that are going to come from that elderly man's air conditioning unit in Paris. I know I had read numbers out of California, and it was saying that one wildfire in California undid like 10 years worth of their green policies. So you just see that there's things that we can do to improve the environment that aren't going to have such an impact and harm people's lives.
Right. And I think that's a really great example because obviously what we're saying here is, look, again, we ought to have dominion, not domination. And so, when the weather is hot air conditioners are very good things. And so if you're telling an elderly man that he can't use an air conditioner because in order to protect the environment, again, you're putting nature over humanity. And so I love your point that essentially we have to come up with better solutions to protect the environment, but let's keep people first and people's needs first, right? And I think that your example right there shows that idea inverted. Let's protect the environment even if it's going to kill this elderly man, and that's not the solution, right? So Pope Benedict XVI often spoke about human ecology. Mm-hmm. What is human ecology?
So human ecology is really just kind of the natural order of the human person and of the family that God in scripture and through, his grand plan for all of our lives has a vision of marriage and of family. And if we don't follow the order that's been set before us, it's something that eventually ends up harming us.
Mm-hmm. And why can't we separate care for creation from care for human life? You already mentioned in some ways, but have either Pope Benedict XVI or Pope John Paul II shared any thoughts about that?
I know Pope Benedict talked a lot about just really how it is the same mentality for both that drives degradation of the human family and degradation of the environment. That if we are a person that views our own children as disposable, it's very likely that we're not going to care that much about the earth around us. So just that we need to have this holistic approach of care for creation as a whole. It just makes sense when you think about it logically that if you have children and you have a family, you want them to grow up in a nice world. And I think that's one of the reasons that I felt so passionate about starting Vita at Terra is because within the pro-life movement, we don't see a lot of conversations about care for creation. And, we're seeing a little more about the importance of getting our kids outside, but just that we should be the first people to want to be engaged in these kind of environmental conversations because we have families that are going to be invested in the future. And it was really just kind of a glaring gap I saw. So I'm someone who I'm very pro-life, but I've also always cared about the environment. And when I was in college, I actually was a backpacking guide one year in the Rocky Mountains. And I just remember being so surprised when I got there because there's all these people who love nature, leave no trace camping. We had to take this wilderness safety thing to get certified. But everyone was very, very progressive. Rarely did I meet another Christian, let alone Catholic. And I was just surprised because I had thought, I'm someone who I'm motivated by my faith to want to get out and be in nature and be in creation and ensure that creation is better for my friends and I guess future children at that point. But it's just often the individuals who are very involved in nature don't have a faith background. And I think that's really unfortunate. And we need to get more people of faith involved in the outdoors.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, of course, the environment affects us, affects our health. We need vitamin D. The best place for vitamin D is getting sunshine, right? We want clean air, clean water. This is good for each one of us to thrive. And children, and we have to think about the future generations and what we leave behind for them as well. Mm. So in your example, so obviously pro-life ethics and authentic environmental stewardship go hand in hand. Can you give an example of how pro-lifers specifically they can really embody this environmental stewardship in a way that is from a Catholic and a pro-life perspective in their day-to-day life?
I think that pro-life individuals and kind of the environmental movement, they're two things that go together and make a lot of sense to me because they both begin with the same question and kind of the same mentality of, are we going to receive life and, creation as a gift or something to control? And that is really the mindset that I try to advocate for is viewing things as a gift and as a blessing. And that's something that you can incorporate in your day-to-day life. I think that it's always a good thing, even whether you're in an apartment or a home, wherever you are, to make the conscious effort to get outside and enjoy God's creation. I think that there's a reason, when you're in DC and in cities, they do build green spaces. People love green spaces. And it's something that I genuinely believe, like, it naturally points back to the creator. You're in this very like concrete jungle, and you seek out places that are full of natural life, is something I've always found. And I think others do too.
Mm-hmm. And we started to discuss a little bit about some of the environmental toxins as a result of these bad decisions on mistreating the environment. What concerns you the most?
I think one of the things that concerns me the most, and you touched upon a little, and I believe it does not get nearly enough traction as it should, so I will talk about it all the time, is the chemical abortion pill in the water. I think this is something that is shocking that our government and regulatory agencies are not investigating. So the numbers on paper, and I don't believe the numbers because they're all self-reported. Right now, we're thinking around 800,000 chemical abortions are taking place a year in the United States. And again, this is self-reported. So there is no abortion database in the United States. There are some places in Europe, but there's not here. And it is just hundreds of millions of tons of fetal tissue. And then also the chemical abortion pill being flushed into our waterways. And I know they were working on it for a while, but I think it was a week or two ago, the study went public. There were some professors, I think it was at Franciscan University and Ave Maria, who looked at 4 different cities, and they studied downstream of the major cities where obviously abortions take place in major cities a lot, and found that within a 90-day period, you were consuming the equivalent of 1 dose of mifepristone. And this is a medication that it doesn't metabolize, like it doesn't disappear in the water. So it's fat soluble, and like this drug sticks around. And this is something that can affect fish and wildlife. And I know that the study that they had done was advocating, what is it called? The Endangered Species Act, that we are required to look at how drugs and how different things affect our water and how they affect animals. Like, this is existing legislation. So trying to use that as the mechanism to get the federal government to look into it. And obviously that is a concern, but in my mind, it's just the legal avenue to get the investigations to happen. But my true concerns are on human beings. And what is this doing to our fertility? They're saying it's 1 in 6 women are struggling with infertility. And you can't tell me that having large doses of progesterone in the water, it doesn't play a role in this. So I think this is something in the coming years, as it starts to get more attention, people are going to be concerned that it's not okay that we're aborting babies at this mass scale, that we're doing it at home, not under the supervision of a doctor. And then also that, again, we've talked a lot about the integral ecology and how everything's connected, that the decisions of one woman to abort her child, it's affecting her, it's affecting her partner, it's affecting that baby she aborted. And now it could even be affecting somebody else in her town who's now struggling with infertility because of the medications she flushed into their water system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and obviously we don't think abortion should exist at all, right? People should not be killing their own children. And again, these issues about the chemical abortion, which is you're sending a woman home with mifepristone, misoprostol. She's aborting in the toilet herself. You're leaving a woman to manage an abortion by herself in her home, which is so scary. We've discussed this on this podcast before. But then again, the mifepristone in the water, and even, as I mentioned, the hormonal birth control, estrogens and progesterones, and how is estrogen affecting males, right? When there's so much estrogen in the water from the birth control pill, and obviously men have a certain number of estrogen that shouldn't go over, and vice versa. So it's all very scary. Speaking of our water, how much gets filtered out? What gets filtered out? Is it even safe to drink, faucet water? We actually use a Berkey filter in our home, but what has your research shown about the safety of water and what chemicals are filtered out, what are not?
Yeah, That is a great question, because to be honest, a lot of the water is not filtered that great. At my own house, we're on a well, and so we have our whole own filtration system set up. But it is a big concern of mine that both the water we drink and the food we eat has chemicals that, we talk about forever chemicals and the PFAS and the water. And it is very unfortunate that there are big corporations with lots of money that want to be able to continue using these kinds of chemicals that we know have documented harm to individuals. And I think that's one of the exciting opportunities, though. And I always try to look at the hopeful message and vision of innovation and technology. So I will say I was very disappointed earlier this year. Glyphosate, it's one of the chemicals that's often in wheat, and our breads, our pastas, and has shown to be cancer causing. So I can't remember what exactly the bill was, but basically the Trump administration had signed something saying we can continue to use this chemical that we know causes harm because there's not an alternative right now. Our farmers need to be able to kill the weeds so they can keep using this dangerous chemical. But then you start seeing things about like new technologies where, I don't know if you've ever seen any of these videos. I think it's NVIDIA. They have combines that can like laser zap the weeds away from the crops. And so it's things like that I think, hey, this could be a solution, that we could get rid of the weeds without dumping chemicals on our food supply. So I am hopeful that we start embracing some new agricultural technologies that let us move away from such harmful chemicals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you bring up a great point, because obviously it's not just what's in our water, but as you said, things are our crops are sprayed with pesticides,
Mm-hmm.
and even the animals that are farmed, for us, whether it's the chickens, etc. A lot of them have a lot of antibiotics and other hormones that they're pumped with, and
Mm-hmm.
so again, the point you make, which is that we have to use our human ingenuity to come up with solutions that protect both nature, but more importantly, our own health as humans. And so it's looking at how can we respect nature, and also how can we make sure that the food we eat and the water we drink is safe and healthy for us, and for the environment, right? And it doesn't have to be an either or, right? It can be that, like you said, that there can be solutions that are healthier and safer for both people and the environment. And that's what we should aim for. So, how should Catholics think about environmental justice while remaining rooted in Catholic anthropology?
So how should we think about environmental justice? I will say that is one of the things. So when founding Vita at Terra, I think a lot of times the word justice has kind of been hijacked. And I almost think, like, as Catholics, when I was looking up, and there are some other Catholic environmental organizations, but we often use the term justice to envelop a lot of ideas, and some that may not be so Catholic. And, I'll see organizations say, in our fight for environmental justice, we also need to secure abortion rights and secure LGBTQ and homosexual marriage and different things. So I tend to steer away from the term justice, because I think, unfortunately, it can have some negative connotations. But I think that if we just want to, if as Catholics, we want to think about seeking the good for each other and for nature, everything to me really just boils down to kind of subsidiarity is a word I like to use, and making intentional choices in your everyday life. I think that if we want to think about how we better the environment, it needs to start with ourselves, with our own lives, and if we have families, with our own families. It's actually a really good example. You were talking about food and how, chickens are full of antibiotics and just different things. I think one small thing that people can do is just, in terms of their meat, buying locally. Sometimes it's obviously a bigger investment up front, but I've been very surprised that meat. So for example, we for 3 or 4 years now have bought like a quarter cow from a local farmer. And I think it comes down to maybe $4.99 or right around $5 per pound of meat. Well, I went to the store because we had ran out and tried to buy a steak. And it was like $22 a pound or something crazy. And so it's like you're able to save money overall. I know it's the upfront is more, but you're saving money. You're buying locally. You're knowing where your food's coming from. You're helping an individual family. And you're not shipping your meat from halfway around the globe to come to you. And it's just being able to make small decisions in your own life that do end up having that ripple effect.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And again, supporting small businesses, supporting local farmers, local communities, all of that is super important. and and obviously it's healthier. And when they say eat local, for example, there's things in the local fruits and vegetables that actually help your immunity, right? When you eat locally. And so there's also a reason for that when they say that, because it's actually building up what you need in that specific environment, in that local environment.
I think my mom has always told me honey, they say if you have local honey, it helps with allergies or something.
That's great. Yeah. Creation is beautifully made, right, by
Yeah.
God. And it's actually meant to help us, right? That's the point. So let's review some of these key principles. If you have identified life, stewardship, and conservation as 3 key principles, why did you begin with life?
Well, I began with life really looking at the gap that I saw in the environmental movement. And I think that what hasn't happened and what needs to happen is life needs to be the foundation. Because if life isn't our first principle and what we're pointing to, things become very anti-life. And just the importance of human dignity is something I want to champion. And I think that our environmentalism is something that should be ordered around that.
Mm-hmm. And what does authentic stewardship require beyond simply, quote unquote, being environmentally friendly? Or what does that even mean to be environmentally friendly?
Yeah, I think that's a good question and actually makes me immediately think of the whole like everybody had plastic straws all of a sudden because it was going to like save the sea turtles. And that being environmentally friendly, like it doesn't mean virtue signaling or like hopping on some trend because it's going to quote unquote save the planet. It it really just looks like responsibility and like being intentional with your decisions. That I think a lot of times environmentalists like they just want other people to think that they're being a good person and they have this fancy water bottle. And it's good to make, more green or clean decisions, but you shouldn't be motivated by what other people think of you. Like you need to be motivated by your faith and by your search for truth and trying to better creation.
One of the questions I have, just as an example, we recycle. I'm wondering how well the recycling program usually works. There's been stories about, people recycling and then things ending up together with the trash anyway. And that's discouraging because, if people take the time to recycle, is that actually making a difference? Is it, yeah, what does the research show on that, for example?
So that is something, and I'm glad you bring it up because it's actually in my list in the next week or two to want to dig into more. I know Alex Clark just had a podcast on her Culture Apothecary where she had a guest on that it's supposedly like exposing the recycling world. But I do know, and I know this because growing up, my father's a construction worker, and he would always tell me that they would pick up the recycling and take it to the landfill. And he's like, it all goes to the same place. But I have seen multiple reports that is true. So it's something that I need to research more to see the scale or what exactly has gone on. But it definitely is unfortunate. And so again, I think it's when you can take your own responsibility and like not rely on other people to do things for you. If you want to compost, like you yourself can then know, like I have composted this actually happened. You're not like banking on this other organization or industry to do it for you. But
we'll certainly have to have you back on that specific topic because that's of interest to me. If we go through the trouble of recycling, and that's something that we want to do to protect the environment, we hope that it's actually ending up where it's supposed to and being reused in a responsible way as opposed to ending up in a landfill. But again, that's something to look into. And, we were also talking about forever chemicals. And that's something that I've been concerned about. We actually switched out so many things in our home because of those things, whether it's the candles, the plastics, right? Switched it to glass so that we can reuse things and not have so many plastic containers. We don't even like to use plastic containers anymore as much as possible. Obviously, some groceries still come in plastics, and you can't really control that as much. But there's ways that people can just kind of implement it in their own life, in small ways, I think, and even those small ways show a regard for the environment and also for your own health. When you know that there's these forever chemicals in certain things, or in just making sure that your fruits and vegetables are washed so that you're not getting pesticides and other PFAS that are on your food, as part of it. But can we do away with those things so they don't end up on our food, right? This is all part of the conversation about the environment, because it is affecting us. It's not just that. Yeah.
I would say, I think a lot of it too, it just kind of plays into this overall kind of problem that we have in America across the board with consumerism, that we just want so many things that didn't exist before. Because so you're saying like trying to replace candles and this and that. And you think about like the body washes, the perfumes, like just all these masses of products and makeup. I'm like, I wear it. And people didn't used to have so many things. And now we just have so much. And then, by the way, that's also filled with chemicals. So it's difficult because you trying to like live smaller, like buy less things, but then you have to be so conscious about what things are you buying. And it's just a crazy situation we found ourselves in like the past 50 years or so, because it didn't used to be this way.
Yeah. And I mean, this was shocking to me, but just realizing that, I used to love perfume. Now I just, you have to be very careful what you buy, because a lot of it, like you said, has phthalates in it, which are endocrine disruptors. They actually mess with your own endocrine system. So, I have to be very choosy about what I put on my body. And I think that's important. But I think that where individuals can make a difference too is when we buy things that are more environmentally conscious, that are also better for us. We're creating a demand for those things as opposed to
exactly
the other things that are on the market that are actually harmful. So I think that what we choose to buy and put our money towards, and if everybody did that, people would shift. Even if businesses only cared about their bottom line, they would say, well, maybe what people are interested in is environmentally conscious lines of products. The same with makeup line. I switched makeup to a clean line because I don't want those things affecting my body first and foremost, but it's also, it's not good for the environment. It's not good for me. And so I think these are practical ways that people can kind of take stock of like what's in their house, that is, not good for the environment, that you don't want to end up in a landfill anyway, right? Like more plastics, more, as much as you can avoid. So what obligations do we have toward future generations, and what we create for future generations and what we leave behind?
So with this, a word that I really like to use, and I feel like doesn't get used enough, is duty. And like that we have a duty to those around us. We have a duty to our children. And so kind of like we said, how the abortion issue is connected to all of this. Like if you're a woman and you're pregnant, like you have a duty to that child now. It is now a responsibility of yours, whether you choose to parent or adopt or whatever the choice may be. But like that is your child. You have a duty to them. And I think the same, it's like those duties extend to the environment. Like we have a duty to leave a world for our children. Like we can't just say, oh, who cares? I'm going to be dead in 20 years. Like, let's just throw all the chemicals, ruin the water, like let industry run rampant. I think so many of our problems just go back to this idea of being self-centered and putting yourself first and is the only priority. And if we really shifted our vision to be focused on our children and focused on others, I think the world would be a much better place.
Mm-hmm. And that makes me think of just companies, for example, that cut down trees and then plant new ones.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's such a beautiful mission, right? That, okay, let's use things in the environment, but let's replace them, right? So that future generations can take advantage of them, right? And also having, plants around us is good for the air. Having plants in your own home is good for the air. And so, insofar as we can support companies that do that, I think is another way to show care for the environment. So let's talk about technology and consumerism. We touched on it for a moment in culture. Pope Francis critiques the technocratic paradigm. What does he mean?
Yes. So this is something that I think about a lot, and it makes me nerdy and excited, but it's what we're seeing a lot of right now. And this paradigm is really this unfortunate worldview that's kind of gaining steam and coming out of Silicon Valley, that's putting optimization first, and that everything needs to be optimized. Technical efficiency is the goal and the good. And I think that technology can be good, but you have to use it for good, and it needs to be viewed as a tool. And so I think that Pope Francis kind of was forewarning, and now Pope Leo has had his encyclical out about AI and everything, but that I feel very passionate that the church needs to lead on a lot of these technological conversations and innovation, because we need to make sure that technologies are developing in a way that is a tool and benefits humanity rather than optimizing everything. Human beings are not meant to be optimized. Our goal is not optimization.
Right. And I actually did a commentary on Pope Leo's encyclical. So if anyone is interested in delving into AI and what Pope Leo said in his encyclical, please check out that episode. And yeah, I mean, of course, the optimization that humans are called to is to become virtuous, the best versions of ourselves, but not to become machines, not to become humans 2.0 and throw away, humans, discard humans that, have disabilities or other health conditions, right? And again, this is the kind of culture, I guess, philosophy that is rampant that we have to push back on. How has consumer culture distorted our relationship with creation?
Mm-hmm. I think consumer culture has distorted things because we're viewing everything as something to control or something to purchase. And mentioning optimization and disabilities and different things, it makes me think about a lot of these new emerging technologies when it comes to infertility and IVF. I think the company is called Orchid, based in California. You've probably heard of it, but they are working on optimizing their fertility, that you can choose things like eye color, intelligence. I don't want this characteristic. I don't want that characteristic. And God never created women to have children and our children to be something that we pick and choose and optimize every single one of their characteristics. And like I said earlier, life and creation needs to be viewed as a gift and as a blessing, not as something for us to control. So I think that as consumerism has just kind of ran rampant in our culture, we're applying this control mindset to everything. And that's not necessarily a good thing.
I think that's really beautifully said. And yeah, we did a few episodes on IVF, on designer babies. Again, Dr. Terra Lee gave us the information on this, what's happening with the designer babies. And again, that this is consumerism and treating children as commodities, as products to be manipulated. And so obviously that's one way that we're kind of infringing upon nature. I also like what you had mentioned about consumerism and how it's affecting people in third world countries, etc. Again, another example that I think that people can use and find in their own communities that has helped me with just when you have things that you want to get rid of, instead of throwing them out, if they're usable for somebody else, obviously either donating them so that they can be used by somebody else, or in our community, we have a buy nothing group where you have local groups where people swap items. People post pictures of, hey, I'm getting rid of X, Y, or Z furniture for free. All of this is for free. Who is interested? And then essentially people can pick it up so that it doesn't end up in a landfill if it's still usable. Obviously, things get worn and are not usable for anybody, and those things should be thrown away. But for the things that can be used, why not give them to somebody who doesn't have them? If they're baby items, give them to a pregnancy resource center and they'll be used there. Or again, to your local community, whether a donation center or through the Buy Nothing group, if you have something like that. It's been great because it is what it says, buy nothing. Obviously there's things that you need that you can't just get off of the internet for free, but where you can and save the production of something or share of your goods with other people, I think that it's another beautiful way to implement something like this in just your own daily life. I don't know if you've had any experience with that.
I would say I'm laughing because actually the furniture behind me is from Buy Nothing. And so that, like I was talking about, the importance of your locality and like building a community and like all of this stuff is tied together. That, yeah, when my husband and I first got married, we got married like 2 weeks after I graduated college. We had no money, but like we wanted to start a family and like be married and all this stuff. And we got like almost all of our furniture and our things for our apartment off Buy Nothing or for very low cost on different Facebook groups. But I mean, regardless of the cost, another reason I really like those kinds of avenues and things is because so much of the current things that you purchase, it doesn't even matter how much money you spend on them. They're not made to be high quality items anymore or heirloom items. And so, okay, for convenience, $500 ordered a desk off Amazon, it's going to be made of that kind of like weird particle board. So I always just really encourage people to buy secondhand and antiques because then you're driving down demand for new items and also you're getting a quality item in return.
Well, I think you really scored with the Buy Nothing group because those look amazing.
No, it is crazy. Apparently, it was a family that, DC military bases and stuff, they had moved here and their bedroom set wouldn't fit in their bedroom. And it's like a full piece, like wardrobe, dresser, bed. And we definitely hit the jackpot on it because it's like a multi-thousand bedroom set. And they just said it was very heavy and difficult to move. So we rented a U-Haul and my husband and I just went and picked it up.
Amazing. And like you mentioned, also Facebook Marketplace, people, can go on there, etc. And yes, as we were putting together the home, there's a lot of pieces that were like, oh, Facebook Marketplace, Buy Nothing, etc. And then you just buy whatever it is that you can't find or need. And that actually just drives down, as you said, the demand for purchasing those things new. So those are good examples. How should Catholics evaluate new environmental technologies while protecting human dignity?
Mm-hmm. I think that how we evaluate new technologies is the same across the board. Like, is this going to benefit human beings? And is it going to be used as a tool rather than replacing our humanity? I think that's a really big thing right now is we're seeing AI kind of grow and new things emerge. But also for us to have the understanding, like I said, that there are these new technologies that they can destroy weeds with lasers that like read the mapping of the plants. There are things that can really help us and reduce our need for chemicals and pesticides. So I think that we need to be cautious, but it's also a really exciting time.
Mm-hmm. And how can Catholics avoid reducing environmental issues to partisan politics?
Mm-hmm. I know this is always hard across the board, but I think that how Catholics can avoid reducing it to partisan politics is A, being genuine, and B, just to be honest, and this is the reality of politics, is that you just need to look at policies and things not through a lens of right or left or red or blue, but is this oriented towards virtue? Is this a good policy? And you're going to find yourself agreeing with policies on both sides of the political aisle. And so I think when you do that, it's like you're not hyper-focused that I'm only voting a certain way. You need to view things individually and like vote on things individually.
And, obviously, when we talk about the right to life, and obviously that is a primary, you know, way to make decisions about candidates, et cetera, is where they stand on the life issue. But obviously, too, what I love about the Catholic Church is that it doesn't just align with, the Republican side, because or the Democrat side. There's being Catholic means that there's some issues that lean in one way or another, and I love that it's you can't just fit it into a political box, and so I think as Catholics have to operate from a Catholic understanding as opposed to a political understanding, because our faith should be the thing that informs all of our decision making.
Mm-hmm.
So that leads us straight into the last part that I want to discuss, which is about how to live our faith in this way. What would you say to Catholics who believe environmental stewardship is optional or even a distraction from the church's mission, or, as we discussed, simply a political issue?
So with that question, it makes me think, when I was actually starting Vita at Terra, I was speaking with a lot of different sisters and like religious life and trying to get a handle on like, how do I get Catholics to care and that kind of thing. And, one priest, Father Ed, he said something that really stuck out to me, that he understands and he shares my concerns that a lot of times Catholics don't want to engage in environmental issues because God has put a vocation on their heart to care for the poor or to be really involved in the pro-life space, and that there's kind of all these other issues that people feel their time has already been taken up or consumed with. So we'll just kind of leave the environment over there. But he had just told me that the reality is we are called to live a life of virtue. And right there in Genesis, we are called to till and keep the land. And so it is something that God has called us to do. While we may have a specific vocation on our hearts and we can put our passions into, the environment isn't something we can just forget about or not engage on. And that, it's totally hard, but like, if we want to live a life of virtue, we do have to be conscious of all of these things.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say to the Catholic who thinks that talking about the environment or even engaging on this issue is just a distraction from the church's mission?
I would say that it's not a distraction. Like I've just been kind of saying the whole time, is that this is caring for creation is the issue. And caring for creation is what we need to have people understand needs to be at the forefront of how they live their lives. They need to care about their unborn children, their family, their responsibilities, the natural world. And that if we want to uproot this throwaway culture that's affecting abortion, we have to be engaged in these other issues.
Mm-hmm. Now, we discussed, just some practical ways that people can implement caring for the environment in their own life. What other practical habits can Catholic families adopt to better care for creation?
I know we talked about it a little bit, but it really is like, we just have to make the transition and get rid of the plastics. Like, my husband, it's sometimes a battle. He loves to just throw things in the plastic sandwich bags after dinner. Like, he'll just have pizza and like baggies all in the fridge. I'm like, no, we have to stop doing this. Like, I have the glass containers, just put it in the container. But it's really just a shift of how we live our lives to try to live more sustainably. And again, I know that a lot of times there's a cost associated up front, but if we can just do things little by little, then through time, you have permanent items. Like you have the Pyrex dish, like you have the things that you need, where plastic has just created this constant cycle of rebuying, and you're rebuying things that are literally poisoning you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just about starting to make that shift.
Yeah, and unfortunately, making that shift can more upfront costs or even cost more. But I think that when you're thinking about it, not only from the perspective of the environment, but also for the health of your family, then those are the things that should If it costs more, then so be it, if you can afford it. But obviously, if you just buy the glass containers and then you can continue using them, or for example, with us, with the plastic baggies, we now have biodegradable baggies that we keep reusing anyway, instead of buying the regular plastic baggies when we need to use them. That's what we use because we don't want that leaching into our food anyway. And when we're done using them, after however many times we can, we know that it's not going to harm the environment. So those are, again, small things we could do that really help. So let's look at the bigger picture in Catholic communities. So what can parishes, schools, and Catholic institutions do to live out the church's teaching better?
I think one of the biggest things is building community. And something that I would love and is long-term vision planning for Vita at Terra is really to get involved and have some sort of curriculum, summer series, devotional for youth ministry and for young people to talk about the environment, care for creation. I think back to when I was in high school and I was in youth group, and it really, really impacted me. Jason and Christelina Everett, they had their Theology of the Body, and it was like a summer series. And I think it was like 6 weeks or something in the summer. But just being able to talk about, in that case, it was theology of the body, these big abstract churchy ideas, and like put it into practical ways of how to live the faith in your everyday life. What is the proper order of relationship, sexuality, all these things. But if we could start doing that for young people so that they have this like foundational understanding of what is our relationship with creation? Like, should we care about it? No, it doesn't have to be this progressive, loony left, like hippie issue. So that's something that I would love for Vita at Terra to have in the future, is being able to engage with young people on the issue of care for creation.
Well, that's super exciting work. And what kind of work is Vita at Terra doing today that you're most excited about?
Yes. So I'm very excited. We're planning on launching our first podcast kind of mid-September, with the theme being uprooting the throwaway culture. So having different guests on and then one-off episodes with myself, just discussing what we've been discussing about how this is all related, that you look at surrogacy, IVF, chemicals in our environment, just like all of these issues are related to care for creation, and that we have to really start a movement and get people more passionate about both their children and the natural world around them. So that's one. And then next spring, we're going to start rolling out study guides on our website that are different issue areas through a Catholic lens. So whether it be something like I was talking about the forest management, what the heck is going on with all these forest fires? What does it mean? What could we do better? And then break down existing research and church teachings on the topics and academic articles. So lots of fun stuff in the works. I'm very much looking forward to.
That sounds super exciting. And do you have a name for the new podcast?
I do not yet. So we are open to names.
Okay, well, when you launch it, we'll certainly link to it in our resources page at bioethicsbabe.com. And also all of those resources that you're going to put up on Vita at Terra, we can also link to those in our section on the environment. If Catholics truly embraced the church's vision of creation, what would change in our culture?
I think the biggest change that would happen, and what I would like to see happen, is just a reorientation to view life as a gift. That we have this intrinsic thing in us that, like human beings, we just want to try to control everything. And that has led to some not so great results. So I think that if we really embrace church's teaching and we're open to life, we're good stewards of what God has given us in terms of family and in terms of the environment and the natural world around us, I think that we would start to see some really positive changes.
Mm-hmm. And as we close, what do you hope listeners take away about why caring for creation is an essential part of defending human dignity and promoting authentic human flourishing?
Mm-hmm. I guess with that, I just hope listeners take away that we can't separate life on Earth anymore. We can't just say, I'm only focused on myself, or be on the other side and you're this like kind of anti-humanist, I love the planet and I'm only focused on the planet. That by separating these two things into different camps, we've just seen people who are now very disconnected, who are very unhappy, and don't have the family ties they once had. And then we see kind of the world around us with a lot of pollution, a lot of chemicals. So as Catholics, we just need to really kind of reorientate ourselves to be focused on care for all of creation.
And I mean, I just love what Vita and Terra is doing, especially just bringing home that message that if you care for human life, you must care for the environment, because whatever happens in the environment affects human life and affects us, not just in theory, but it affects every single one of us, and it affects our families. And so when we care for the environment, we're actually caring for people as well. And this is beautiful. And I think that what you're doing, the mission of Vita et Terra, is super important right now. So thanks again, Claire, for being on. And we're going to definitely have you back.
Thank you so much.
Well, from my conversation with Clare Ath, co-founder and president of Vita et Terra, a Catholic environmental organization working to reclaim an authentically Catholic vision of environmental stewardship. Here are 5 key takeaways. 1. Caring for creation is a Catholic responsibility, not a political ideology. Environmental stewardship flows from Scripture and the Church's long tradition. Catholics are called to exercise dominion, not domination, recognizing creation as a gift from God that we are entrusted to care for. 2. The pro-life movement and environmental stewardship belong together. Human dignity is the foundation of authentic environmental stewardship. Caring for creation is not only a Catholic responsibility, but also a way of protecting human life, health, and flourishing. The goal is never to place nature above people, but to recognize that caring for creation ultimately serves human dignity. 3. Environmental problems are bioethical issues because they affect human health. Clean air, clean water, healthy soil, and reducing exposure to harmful chemicals matter because they directly impact fertility, pregnancy, children's health, and the well-being of future generations. Catholics should care about these issues precisely because they care about people. 4. Faithful Catholics can disagree on environmental policies while agreeing on core principles. The Church provides moral principles, not one-size-fits-all policy prescriptions. Catholics should evaluate environmental questions through the lens of human dignity, subsidiarity, prudence, and the common good, rather than partisan politics. 5. Stewardship begins with everyday choices: supporting local farmers, reducing unnecessary consumption, choosing healthier products, minimizing plastic use, and buying secondhand are practical ways Catholic families can live out their responsibility to care for creation while promoting authentic human flourishing. Because truth matters and human dignity isn't optional. This is Bioethics Babe. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Bioethics Babe podcast. If you've enjoyed this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and your favorite podcast platform, and share with your friends and family. Also check out bioethicsbabe.com for the latest episodes and resources.